Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Hey, good. I'm Johnny Miller. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Utah Counties Indemnity Pool, which is an interlocal agency created by the counties some 25 years ago. When the counties found it, they were unable to purchase insurance in the traditional marketplace, particularly for law enforcement. And we're kind of getting back there again, where coverage for certain types of activities of counties is getting very difficult to find in the traditional market. What the counties did then was created this interlocal agency where all the counties put money into the fund, and then when your buildings burn down or get flooded, they call me. When your cars get wrecked, they call me. And when you get sued, they call me, and I hire the attorneys that defend the county for the county attorney's office. Today we're going to talk about ethics in the state of Utah, and the reason that I put together this training session and I conducted all over the state is because this is one of the areas where, when people get in trouble in the county, they call Johnny. When people get in trouble with ethics, they call Johnny, and I have to say, sorry, I can't help you. Because these are violations of the law. Our coverage does not apply to criminal acts, and we'll see that most of the things we're going to talk about today are criminal acts. As well as the fact that because these things become criminal acts, the county attorney also is going to be in a difficult place to provide any assistance to an employee who's allegedly violated this act, because they may be asked to file the charges and prosecute the criminal act later down the road. So hopefully that keeps your attention for the next hour. That these are very important issues for you to understand and make sure you're aware of. Certainly as we go through the day or the morning, let me know if you have questions. We want to make sure that you understand what your obligations are as a county official in the state of Utah when it comes to ethics. And we'll find that when we talk about county official, as far as the ethics acts go, they're really talking about every elected, appointed, and employee of the county. Employees are considered officials when it comes to these ethics acts. So everyone falls under this umbrella. And I found it interesting this morning as I'm sitting here waiting for you guys to come in, that the county has its 5 primary objectives behind me on the wall as far as how they see themselves meeting their mission to the constituents of Weber County. And you'll see there that the second goal that they outline is nurturing the public's trust, their confidence. And I do another training on fiduciary responsibility for the elected officials. And that's one of the fiduciary responsibilities that an officer of a government agency has that an officer of a corporation really doesn't. The corporate officers don't have an obligation to make sure that their customers, their shareholders, have their confidence. The other things that they do will create that confidence. But in government, it's one of our duties to make sure that the people who we work for, who pay our paychecks, have confidence that we're doing our job ethically and legally. What we're going to do today, our objective today, is to review some of the statutory prohibitions and limitations and requirements related to ethical behavior. Now, not all these limitations and prohibitions are all in one nice, clean ethics statute. So we'll have to bounce around from different places within the statutes to find the things that the legislature has said is not appropriate for county officials to be doing. As I started researching the statutes, though, I found it interesting. Back when the legislature used to put in their intent with the law, they don't do that anymore, which I feel is really too bad. It really helped the courts understand what the legislators were after when they would put in legislative intent. But the ethics law here in Utah was passed while they were still doing that. And again, they had their intent, promote the public interest and strengthen the faith and confidence of the people of Utah in the integrity of their government. Sounds great. But I like the second part for people who think that the ethics laws have gone too far. It does not intend to deny any public officer or employee the opportunities available to all other citizens of the state to acquire private economic or other interests, so long as this does not interfere with his full and faithful discharge of his public duties. So they recognize that they don't expect that government employees are not going to buy stock, own portions of businesses, be in business outside the county, have other employment outside the county. They're not talking about limiting you from doing any of those things. They just want to limit you from doing those things if they would have you not faithfully discharge your duties as a public officer. Okay? So let's talk about conflict of interest first, because although throughout the statutes where we talk about ethics, it refers to any conflict of interest. But then again, they don't define conflict of interest clearly anywhere in the statute, which makes a lot of attorneys very wealthy over what is a conflict of interest and what is not a conflict of interest. And the statutes apply to actual or potential conflicts of interest between public duties and your private interests. First of all, those conflicts generally also apply not only to yourself, but others that you're related to, your family members, business partners, things of that sort. That if it creates a conflict, and because you're creating an interest for them, that applies as well. What I like to say when we get to this conflict of interest piece is to use the headline test. If you're doing something that you wouldn't want to see printed as a headline in the newspaper or on the TV news, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. Because that's the standard that others will use, right? If they think that you're not acting ethically, they will file a complaint. And we'll talk about how difficult dealing with a complaint can be in the state of Utah. So we have several different acts that we're going to talk about this morning. First of all, the County Officers and Employees Disclosure Act. For counties, for some reason, they call it Disclosure Act. For municipalities, they call it the Ethics Act. For state employees, they call it the Ethics Act. But for counties, they call it the Disclosure Act. And in reality, there are more items that are just require you to disclose what you're doing than there are things that are prohibited from you from doing. So it's probably actually better to be calling it the Disclosure Act. We're also going to talk about prohibiting employment of relatives, which is another ethical issue. Is there anything morally wrong with a family member supervising another family member? Any outside of government? I mean, how many mom and pop businesses are there all over the county? And there's nothing wrong with that. But in government, there is this belief that you can't have family members supervising other family members. That's just ethically wrong. So that it's an ethical issue. It's not just a simple, clear wrong that would be wrong anywhere else other than when you're talking about government. We're also going to talk real quickly about the Utah Procurement Code, because that includes some items that are ethical concerns that limit what you can and can't do if you are in the procurement process or if you oversee contracts of a vendor that the county is working with after procurement. And then we'll also talk about offenses against administration of government, lastly, where we're talking about the really serious ethical violations. All right. So we'll start with the County Officers and Employees Disclosure Act in Title 17. The act prohibits 3 things, and then it requires disclosure of several others. So we'll start with the prohibitions, because that's what you're probably most all here for, is what can I not do that is going to get me in trouble. So we'll start with this first one, and I'll take them in order that they come in the statute. Disclosure of controlled information for economic interest or special privilege. Quite simply, you cannot disclose controlled or private or protected information for your own personal interests. So many of us have access to controlled or private information here in the county, right? Certainly Sheriff's Department does. We've got information on people. Personnel does. They've got personal information on all kinds of employees. But many of the rest of your departments also have information, either health information, personal information, business information, that is protected and people couldn't just ask for and be provided as a public document. This piece of the statute says you cannot use that information for your own personal interest. Particularly, you can't have another job where they expect that you will bring that information that you have access to at the county to your other job, which makes their job easier. And you probably do have some information in your department, right, that a business outside the county would love to have, but they can't just ask for it because it's not public information. And this act prohibits you from using that information, not only for business, but for any self-interest that you might have. I saw one situation. I used to work with the Minnesota County's insurance group. They had a widespread problem in their counties where certain individuals that had access to the driving records database were running DMV checks on people for their own personal reasons. Boy shows up to take daughter to the dance, run the DMV check to see what's up with this kid that's picking up my daughter for the prom. That ended up in a $20 million lawsuit against the counties for them using that information for their own personal interests rather than using it for what it was meant to be there for. So my advice to you here is, if you need records that the county has that are available to you, don't just bring them up on your computer and hit print. Go around to the other side of the desk and fill out a GRAMA request the same as anyone in the general public would. And that way you don't have to worry. If it's public records, fine. It wouldn't have been a violation here anyway, but if there's anything there that might have been protected, you haven't violated the act. So just go through the same process that any person in the public would to get those records. Okay? Use of position for economic interest or special privilege. And this is the really broad one, right? Using your position as a county employee or county officer for economic interest. You're going to make money somehow because you are a public officer outside of your paycheck as a public officer, or special privilege. Any special privilege. Now, is it a special privilege to be able to use that snowplow to do your driveway, that no one else has access to use the county snowplow to do their driveway, or to use the shop to do an oil change on your personal vehicle because you have access to it that the general public doesn't have access to, or the copier, or AV equipment? There's all sorts of equipment throughout the county that you have access to that this prohibition clearly says you can't use that for your own special privilege. So if it's not available to the public, you shouldn't be using it for yourself. There's certainly, all the counties have in their personnel policies statements about occasional personal use of equipment, the telephones, the computers, things like that, that on your lunch break, yes. If you're going to check your personal email, no big deal. Make sure you're reviewing that section of the statute. Make sure that you're keeping within, that section of the policy, and that you're keeping your use of equipment within the boundaries of what the county has identified as occasional personal use that is authorized for you, okay? But this is one that I see the state auditor has just come up with a sample policy release form and has provided some information on that I think that they've been finding as they've been doing audits, that this has been violated more often than they would like to see it violated, and that they're going to be looking at taking a closer look at that and making sure that government employees aren't using government assets for their own personal use beyond what they should. Questions on that? This is, again, the broad one that lots of people could really have problems with, that really might not be a violation, but they look like it. You know, I always wonder when I see one of the county vehicles, a Rich County vehicle or a San Juan County vehicle parked in the Costco in Salt Lake on Saturday afternoon. I wonder what the heck's going on there. The county is actually out buying things at Costco on Saturday afternoon, or is it an employee using the county vehicle for their own personal use on the weekend? And that's again, if it's not authorized through the county's policy, that person could be in a lot of trouble. And believe me, people are concerned about that. I'm concerned because I'm worried that the county's doing something they're not supposed to. Other people are worried because their tax dollars are being spent inappropriately. You know, that's probably one of the main things that shows up on the fraud hotlines that counties have started to put into place and the states put into place, is arguments that they see these vehicles out and being used for personal use when they shouldn't be. Okay. The third prohibition of the Disclosure Act is accepting a gift or loan. Now, how many of you thought that this was going to be the whole presentation this morning? We're going to talk about gifts and loans and that you can't take them as a government employee. That's what most people think of when they think of the Ethics Act. So we'll look closely at what this statute says, because this is, again, one that people will really get up in arms about. So you may not knowingly receive, accept, take, seek, or solicit, directly or indirectly, for yourself or another, a gift or loan that tends to influence the officer in the discharge of your official duties. Mouthful, right? So we'll break it down. First of all, you may not knowingly receive. So if somebody makes a charitable contribution on your behalf to a charitable organization and you knew nothing about it, they just thought that you did a stellar job in the recorder's office and that you needed to be recognized for that, so they made a charitable donation in your name. You didn't know about it. You haven't violated the act. Receive, accept, take, seek, or solicit. So you don't need to actually get the gift. If you ask for it, you're in violation. All you need to do is seek or solicit it. Certainly taking it or accepting it is red-handed, right? But there have been several arguments made on certain situations where people have argued, we know that they asked for it, they just never got it, but they still asked for it, so they should lose their office and be charged. So be careful with that. Directly or indirectly. So you can't have somebody else ask for the gift for you. That's still a violation of the act. Just because you didn't ask for it directly does not mean you're out of the woods. For himself or another. So again, you ask for this gift to be given to your spouse, or you accept a gift to your spouse, or to your business partner, or to your kids. That's still a gift under the statute, and you're still in violation of the act. Gift or loan. Now, gift is pretty easy. That's what most people think of it. It's cash, it's nice dinner, it's a weekend at a resort, meals, trips, those sorts of things that are commonly considered gifts. But the statute also talks about economic benefit tantamount to a gift, which is defined to be compensation received for private services rendered at a rate substantially exceeding the fair market value. So somebody wants you to make a decision, make a recommendation to the county commission on something that they have an interest in. And they're going to hire you part-time at a rate 3 times what they pay anybody else to do that same work. That's a gift. then you're in violation of the statute. So be very careful with that. Also, a gift is defined to be a loan that is provided at a rate substantially lower than the going rate. So if that's what someone is offering to you, be very wary and understand the person who offers it to you is in violation of the law as well, not just you. So what isn't a gift? And the statute makes that very clear. An occasional non-pecuniary gift having value less than $50, and I hear all the time that that's, people throw that one out. Oh, well, as long as it's under $50, I'm not in any trouble. Yeah. Non-pecuniary, so it can't be any kind of money. If it's a cash card, a gift card with $45 on it, it's still a violation because that is pecuniary. So don't be taking the gift cards. I used to get one of the attorneys that we hire for defense would send me a $100 Nordstrom's card every single Christmas. And every Christmas I'd have to send it back and explain to him, I can't take this. I will lose my job and go to jail for taking a $100 gift card. Well, how about if I send you two $50 gift cards because it's $50? Two things there. Still violates the intent of the act, right? And when I've heard legislators, when they added this into the statute, this $50 limit, they presented to the County Commissioners Association, and they talked about that they see this as an annual amount from any one vendor or person. So that construction company that you're overseeing the contract for, that got a bid and is doing some work for the county, and you're overseeing that project, they take you out to dinner over and over again at $40 a time. Over the course of the year, you are probably in violation of this statute. Again, it's not something you'd want on the headline, right? So be careful with that. Also, an award publicly presented is not a gift. So as long as it's done here in public, where people can see that you're getting that gold watch or that plaque or something along those lines, then it's okay, because the public knows that you've received that. A bona fide loan made in the ordinary course of business, that's at a reasonable rate. And of course, this law was written by legislators, so a political campaign contribution is not a gift, right? They got to look out for themselves. So now that we're at the end of the three prohibitions, I want to get to the penalties to get you through before we start with the things that you need to be disclosing, because they are pretty serious. In addition to any other provision of law, you shall be removed from office or employment. And note the word shall. This is not something that you come up here and plead to the county commissioners that they not fire you for this. They have no choice. You are done. Shall be removed. And a Class A misdemeanor to a felony, depending on the extent of the violation. And for the gift giving, if it's over 150, gets upped in the class of misdemeanor. I think it goes to $2,500. Anything over a $2,500 gift is a felony. Pretty serious. So again, watch out for these things. And when you read this section of the statute, because I know you're all going to go back to your office and look this statute up, right? This is just super exciting. It says in there that the ethics statutes do not apply if the official or employee is chargeable for the same conduct under 76.8.105. Oh, there's a safety valve here that you get out and you're not in violation of the Ethics Act. That sounds good, except for that reference is to the Bribery Act. So let's talk about the difference between accepting a gift and taking a bribe. Bribery is promising, offering, agreeing to, or giving, to give or giving either directly or indirectly any benefit to another, with the understanding or the purpose or the intent to influence that action, decision, opinion, recommendation, or judgment. So the real difference here is that With a gift, it might influence you in your decision making because this person's being really nice to you and giving you a gift. A bribe, it's understood. I give you this gift, you make the recommendation that I'm asking for. I give you this gift, you vote my way on your committee. Okay? If that's what the person is offering to you, you're talking about, again, losing your job, but a third-degree felony for up to $1,000, second-degree felony if it exceeds $1,000. Not something you want to be considering. All right. Next is requiring a donation, payment, or service to government agency in exchange for approval. Now, that for some of you, that may sound really odd. Wait a minute, the county asks contractors and things, others, to provide certain services in exchange for an approval all the time, right? Well, as long as you've gone through the process and it's in the public record that that person is doing it of their own free will, they're providing this to the county, and they're not being coerced, then it's okay. But for you to strong arm someone and say, you're not going to get this recommendation unless you give this to the county is a violation of the statute. So be very careful when you are asking for things of others, that you're not falling into this area, that what you're asking for of them is a legitimate request that they are going to make of their own free will, voluntarily, okay? And there are some requirements there as far as having that clarified in writing when you do that. Failure to disclose personal investments in a business which creates a conflict. So you own part of a company that their business depends on some of the things that the county does. So decisions that are made at the county affect the profitability of that company that you have an interest in. You are required to disclose that to the county. Okay? So the county decides to provide some private security in place of patrol, and you happen to own part of the private security company in town. You'd want to disclose that to make sure that you're not in violation of the code. But that can be in any of your departments, right? Government has been pushing out a lot of their services to private vendors over the years, more and more, right? So many of your departments may have private vendors that do some of the work related to your department. And if you own an interest in those businesses, be sure you disclose it. One of the more clear ones, we had a recorder in one of the counties that was brought up in front of the Ethics Commission over the only title company in the county was owned by the recorder's wife. And the argument was, if you bring anything into the recorder's office that comes from any other title company other than the one that's owned by his wife, it won't get filed. There'll be reasons why it's not correct, and you need to go back and get a new title done on it. So, you know, there's a lot of different places where you can get in trouble with this type of a situation, and that's a very painful process to get through to clear your name once those types of allegations have been made. But if you disclose it, you're home free. Doesn't say you can't have interest in a business that which creates a conflict. You just have to disclose it, which usually requires that you, every January, you fill out a disclosure statement, and most counties send those out to everyone each year. You fill out that disclosure statement, and then any time that issue, this business, comes up in a discussion that you're involved in, that you have some input into, you disclose again at that meeting your conflict. Okay. Compensation for assisting in a transaction with the agency. So someone comes to you and says, you really know how all this works. So will you help me get my permit through the county? And I'll pay you to help me. Now that just sounds wrong, right? You work in the county and you're going to get paid to help someone get something through the county? Actually, it's okay to do that as long as you disclose it. You might still decide not to get paid for it just because, again, you don't want the headline and you don't want to have to prove that you did nothing wrong. But you should know that this is out there. If someone asks you to assist them and they offer to pay you for it, make sure you do the disclosure or you're in violation of the act. Participating in an official transaction with a business the officer or employee has an interest in without disclosure. So again, if you have any interest in a business that does business with the county, you need to disclose that. Disclose it yearly in your conflict of interest statement and disclose it any time that it comes up as a discussion where you're involved. Okay? Inducing others to commit a violation is also a violation of the statute. So this is kind of the, hey, everybody does it, so if I'm going to do it, I'm going to get everybody else to do it, and then it seems to get watered down and nobody cares if everybody does it. So if you have someone trying to get you to just make some copies of those protected records, because I've got a guy that'll pay you to get them. That's good money, easy access. Don't fall for it. And that person is committing a violation. All right. That's the Disclosure Act. Not a lot there, right? Not a lot there, except it's very broad. So that's the concern that we have, is that people there's a lot of different things that could fall under one of these prohibitions or requirements to disclose. So if you have a question, first of all, just fill out a disclosure form. Bring it up at your meetings that you have a potential conflict, and that's going to cover you most of the time. If you do have any of these conflicts, particularly with regulated business, that's one that I see all the time. You and your siblings own a cafe in town. The cafe is regulated by the health department, right? Which is part of the county. You have to disclose that. Any business that is regulated by or does business with the county. So be sure that you're catching those things. Questions on the Disclosure Act? Let's move on then. Did I hit that? To the Nepotism Act, or the Prohibiting Employment of Relatives Act. Is the way that they refer to it in the statute. The purpose is to restrict employment of relatives in local government to limit conflicts of interest. And we have there the list of all the family members that are prohibited from one person supervising another under this law. Pretty long list. Now here in Weber County, it's probably less of a problem, but when I do this training in San Juan County or Millard County or Paiute County, this list is everybody in the county. It gets really tough. And there are some exceptions to smaller areas that we'll get to, but when you're talking about all the way down to father-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, son-in-law, grandsons, granddaughters, first cousins, mother, I mean, that's a lot of people in some of these counties that we need to be aware that if any of those other people are working in our department, we need to make sure that if one becomes a supervisor of another, that we need to deal with the act. And here's how we need to deal with it. No officer may employ, appoint, vote for, or recommend the appointment of a relative in any employment paid from public funds if the employee will be supervised by a relative. So it's not just the relative supervisor who hired him on and is supervising him that's in trouble. Everyone in the chain. Everyone that recommended that person, everyone that employed that person. So HR, the commissioners who approve the hire, the person who is going to supervise, the person who went through all the applicants and decided that this is the person we're going to hire, knowing that it was a relative of the supervisor that was going to be supervising the person, and the person who takes the job. Every one of them is in violation of the act. And that's important because, as we see, the penalty here is a misdemeanor for every single day that that person is employed. So we don't think about it until a year after the person's been there. What's 365 times one misdemeanor? It's a pretty serious charge, isn't it? So we need to be careful with this. Now, we've got exceptions here. If the person's appointed is an appointee qualified through civil service or merit system laws, then we're okay. Then no one's going to jail for that. But there's some things we need to do instead. If the appointee is paid from vocational training funds, that's an exception. Employment is for a period of 12 weeks or less, so a temp employee doesn't count. The appointee is a volunteer. Okay, why would we even have that in there? Some of you have maybe sat through my volunteers training. In the state of Utah, there is no such thing as a government volunteer. If they volunteer time to a government entity for purposes of liability and injuries and things of that sort, they are an employee, the same as any of you. So that's why they put those guys in here. Or the chief administrative officer determines the appointee is the only or the best person available, qualified, or eligible for the position. They're the only person out there that can do the job. Then that you can make that exception. But the CAO has to recognize that, and they have to certify it in writing. So again, an appointee cannot accept a job when they know that the person who's going to be their direct supervisor is a relative. It's a violation for them as well. So if you fit under one of those exceptions, well, there's a couple more exceptions here on this list. The relative was employed prior to the supervisor assuming the position. So 2 co-employees, no problem. But now one gets promoted to supervising the other. Now we have a problem. But that isn't a violation of the act as long as we take the precautions that we'll get to here in a second, okay? Then again, we have the civil service, vocational training funds, temporary, volunteer, or the person was the only person available or capable of doing the job, then we're okay. But if we are going to work under any of those exceptions, the supervisor has to make a complete written disclosure of the relationship to the employee and or the appointee to the chief administrative officer. So you're going to make that written declaration to the commission. And that supervisor cannot evaluate the performance of that employee, and they cannot recommend salary increase for that employee. Would that make it really difficult to supervise someone if you can't do a performance appraisal of them? Kind of takes away one of the major things that a supervisor does. So that would be very difficult, I think, for most of you to try and work with that. So that would keep you from having employees supervised by a relative in most cases, unless you can get around that. Luckily, you're a larger county that you might be able to find a way that somebody else is going to judge their day-to-day performance that's not their direct supervisor. If you can find a way to do that, great. Here's the exception in rural areas. Employment of a relative, the restrictions do not apply if fewer than 3,000 people live within 40 miles of the place of employment. Place of employment. So not the employer. So, when I do this training in Box Elder and we're talking about hiring somebody for the fire department way out in the West End, there's fewer than 3,000 people that live within 40 miles of the fire station. they fall under this exception. I don't know if there's any spots like that in Weber County where you've got less than 3,000 people within 40 miles. But again, even in that situation, the job opening had to be reasonably noticed to the public, and the relative still has to be the best and most qualified candidate. Because I see a little bit of gray hair in the room. This used to be a pretty big problem. When I was a kid, you know, I started my training going to school for law enforcement, and I tried my best to get on the sheriff's volunteer ranger unit to patrol the parks in the county that I lived in, but I just simply didn't have the right last name. And it was the same in the fire department, and it was the same in the road department. If you weren't a relative of somebody that was in the department, you just didn't get hired by the county. This was in Minnesota, folks. It probably never happened here in Utah. But that's why they implemented these laws, to make it open and fair for anyone to be able to get a job in government, not just persons that were related to others that were already in government. Okay? Questions on nepotism? If you've got this going on and you see it as a problem, let's talk about it, get HR involved, and see how we make sure that we're covering one of the exceptions. Ethics in purchasing. To ensure fair and equitable treatment of all persons who deal with the procurement system is the intent of the ethics or the procurement code. Now, each county gets to pass their own procurement code, but many counties use language very similar to the State Procurement Act, which requires a lot of different things. But one of the things that I see most every county put into their procurement code is this limitation that you cannot accept gifts through the procurement process either to get the contract or to oversee the contract after it's been bid out. Here, your limitation on the gift drops down to $10, not $50. So in general, like a non-pecuniary gift less than $50 is not a gift under the statute. But if you're involved in the procurement process, you buy things for the county, or you oversee contracts for vendors, it goes down to 10. Lunch at the cafe, not at a nice restaurant in Salt Lake. Okay. Penalty here is Class B misdemeanor if the total value is less than 100, goes all the way up to a second-degree felony if it's more than a $1,000 gift that you've accepted. So if you're in that process, beware. And again, I'm talking to you about what is a violation of the code in Utah. Most county policies in these areas are more restrictive than the state law. So make sure, again, if you're in the procurement process in the county, you'll want to check that section of the county policy to see if they've restricted the gift giving even less than $10. Some of them just prohibit it, $0 amount is acceptable. So make sure you know your county code in that area as well. Now, we talked about people coming to you and offering gifts, offering bribes, trying to get to create some influence on you. So one of the things I wanted to drop in here too is also the fact that threatening a public servant is a violation of that offenses against the government. So if someone is really pushing you to violate any of these acts, understand that it may be a violation of the Act, the Ethics Act, or the Nepotism Act, but it might also be a violation here in the Offenses Against Government Code that they are threatening you. And certainly any other type of threat that you receive as a government employee, you should be reporting under this section of the statute. Okay? Now, it's probably because you all knew that this section was going to be recorded. I usually get lots of questions and what ifs during this presentation. So are there any questions? Anything you'd like to have clarified? For how many was this the first time that you've had training in ethics? as a county employee. Yeah, usually it is. Very few people are out there. I think the state auditor's office is working on developing an ethics training, but it is an area that their office is very concerned about, the treasurer's office as well. And so I think we'll see more concern over this. One of the things I hadn't talked about yet is what happens if you violated this. Under the code, any person who lives and pays taxes in the county can file a complaint. It doesn't need to be someone in the county, in county government. It can be any constituent out there. And they don't even have to live and pay taxes in the county. If there's one person who lives in the county that doesn't pay taxes somehow, and one person who lives outside the county but pays fees or taxes in the county, the two of them together can file a complaint. So there's lots of people who can file a complaint on this, and all they need to have is actual knowledge. They saw you in the county vehicle in the parking lot at Costco on Saturday. Now you're in front of the Ethics Commission trying to explain why you were driving that county vehicle on Saturday and in the Costco parking lot with your kids in the car. That ethics committee, if the county hasn't passed their own local ethics committee, and I think Washington County is the only one that's done that, you go to the state political subdivisions ethics committee, which has subpoena power. They can find you in contempt. You must provide to them any and all records that you have that they want. So cell phone records, email records, all of those things they can subpoena from you. It is not a nice process to be in, to be alleged to have violated any of these things in the Disclosure Act or the other acts we talked about today. So if you have a question or a concern, either give me a call or contact the county attorney's office. If you aren't in violation yet, their office will probably give you some advice, or talk to your own attorney, or just simply bring up the statutes that I referenced today and take a look at them. So again, this has been a summary only. There are other places within the statute that the legislature is continuously putting things that prohibit government employees from doing things. It's just a matter of trying to find them where they put them, because they don't do it very logically. So with that, if there are no other questions, thank you for your time and attention.